So thank you everyone so much for coming today. I'm very excited to have our guest speaker, Patrick Davies, a writer, company advisor, mentor, a British diplomat for 25 years, wrapping up his career as the UK's Deputy Ambassador to the US from 2013 to 2018, where he worked alongside, of course, both the Trump and Obama White Houses for 5 years. Earlier in his career, Davies served in the British embassies in Morocco, Poland, and Iran. He was Private Secretary, Deputy Chief of Staff to two Foreign Secretaries, Robert Cook and Jack Straw, from 2000 to 2003, and led the UK's response to the Arab Spring from 2010 to 2012. So thank you so much for being with us today, Patrick Davies. Just a little heads up of how today's program is going to work. I'm going to hand over to Patrick. He's going to introduce his fantastic new book, which I have right here, The Great American Delusion. I highly recommend it. And he's going to talk a bit about that. And then we're going to have some Q&A, and I really love to get your audience questions. So please feel free after the talk to put them in the chat, and I'll remind you of that later on. So I'm going to hand over to Patrick.
Thanks very much, Laura, and hello to everybody this beautiful sunny day. You'll see them. I'm in a car. That's because Virgin Media decided to cut off my Wi-Fi this morning for maintenance without telling us. So I've come to somewhere with a good phone signal. So I hope you can all hear me, and do somebody signal if I start breaking up and become incomprehensible. So Laura, thank you for that very generous introduction. What I wanted to do quickly today is sort of take you through the sort of main theme of the book, if you like, and then open this up to questions, and we can talk about anything that is of interest from my experience of both the Obama administration, because I think it's your Obama week this week, but also how that contrasted with Trump, because it was quite different, as you could imagine. But let me start by just bringing us right up to date, because the end of April marks the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. And I think we've all seen that that's been quite a huge transformation from the chaos and the scandal and the noise of the 4 years of Donald Trump. And Biden and Harris have moved quite quickly to overturn a lot of the more controversial policies that Trump put in place. They've rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, and indeed today, Joe Biden is hosting a 40 head of government summit on climate change. And they've rejoined the World Health Organization that Trump left in the middle of a global pandemic. They've got rid of the Muslim ban, as it was called, that restricted travel to America of people from certain Muslim countries. They've stopped construction on the border wall. And of course, most importantly, perhaps right now on the pandemic, they have ramped up the vaccination program massively, and I think will overtake most of the rest of the world quite quickly in their vaccinations. I think they're now ahead of schedule to deliver 200 million doses by the end of the 100 days. They've passed a massive 1.9 trillion COVID relief package, which puts lots of money into people's pockets who've been struggling from the pandemic. And looking ahead, they're beginning work on a essential, in my view, $3.2 trillion infrastructure plan to modernize US infrastructure that really is creaking. And for the rest of the world, they're starting to re-engage internationally too. There's been tentative steps made on the Iran nuclear talks and trying to bring America back into that agreement. As I've mentioned already, the climate summit today, which is looking ahead to when we, the UK, host COP26 in September in Glasgow. And the Biden administration has hit Russia quite hard with a raft of new sanctions, really quite tough sanctions, because of their interference in previous American elections and some cyber attacks. And then finally, if you like, is the announcement last week, I think it was, that American troops will be withdrawing from Afghanistan completely by the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which is this September. So that's quite a lot to have done in the first 3 months of a presidency, and people are already comparing Biden's first 100 days to Roosevelt in the 1930s, when he put in place the New Deal and other significant responses to the Great Depression. So that's a lot going on. So that's all rather positive, and I think genuinely it is positive. So what's the but? Well, the but for me is that, it's absolutely right that Biden and Harris are tackling the immediate challenges of the pandemic and the economic crisis it has caused. That's obviously the right thing to focus on, but that's going to take up a huge amount of bandwidth for the months ahead and indeed years ahead because of the impact and how long the pandemic may last. But it's actually only part of the story. It's only part of the challenges that America needs to address, in my view, to set itself back on track and secure its position as the global superpower. And what I write about in my book, which Laura mentioned, The Great American Delusion, is how the US seems to have been blinded by myths of its own exceptionalism for a number of decades, meaning that quite serious and systemic problems in the US have either been overlooked or not dealt with at all. And that leads us into the situation we find ourselves with in the US right now. So what are these myths? Well, they're well known to all of us here in the UK as well, because they're part of the whole idea of what America is and what it stands for. And they are America as the Western democracy to which other countries looking to transition from different systems aspire. It is the opportunity for all of the American dream. If you just work hard in the US, you will make it. It's the success of the US capitalist model, their economy. They're still the richest economy in the world. So they're seen to have this secret sauce, if you like, that makes them more successful economically than others. It's the thriving melting pot where immigrants from all over the world have moved to the US, helped build the country and share in its success. And there are others around the US's quite unique approach to the freedom of speech and how that's seen to underpin American democracy, how the Constitution clearly separates church and state, so religion and politics don't mix in the US, and there's freedom for all religions. And of course, there's the whole issue of guns, which we can talk about as this sort of inseparable part of what being an American is, and indeed many Americans would say, keep them safe. So why did I write then? I mean, for me, the longer I spent in the US, particularly most recently, the 5 years in the embassy in Washington, I came to realize just how widely these myths are held to be true in a way that I don't think is the case quite so much in other parts of the world. Now, all countries have their national myths, and indeed we could have a separate discussion around how British national myths played into the Brexit debate. But America seems to take it to just a whole new level. You cannot avoid the exceptionalism narrative in the US. It's absolutely everywhere. And of course, it's in their politics. People campaigning for office talk about, how they will secure American greatness and uniqueness, et cetera, and those in power will use American exceptionalism arguments to win support for certain policies that they want to put in place. But it's more than that. It's in their movies constantly, from everything from Disney animated classics to modern films. That concept of American uniqueness is often there. It's in their music. Think about the lyrics of country music and what they tell us about America. It's in their sport, of course. I mean, the World Series in baseball is only American teams, but it's the World Series. I mean, that's a bit of a silly example, but it's everywhere in the US. And I think, as I say, that's led to the belief in that sort of exceptionalism has led to America overlooking some really quite fundamental issues, challenges. And because they've been overlooked, that's fueled the division we've seen in American society. It's played into the partisanship in politics, and it risks accelerating American decline if it isn't dealt with. Now, I think people look back now, albeit it's only 3 months ago, they look back at the 4 years of Trump and think he was the cause of these challenges the Americans are facing. But that would be a misinterpretation of the situation, in my view. I think Trump was the first, if you like, political manifestation of this, what I call myth blindness. It was a failure of the US to adapt and reform to a changing world that created an environment where a brash, pretty angry narcissist could get elected on the back of quite simplistic and nationalistic promises of America first, make America great again, that really played on the fears of a significant proportion of the American population who feel left behind by the pace of change in the world today. But Trump for me was a symptom. He's not a cause of the challenges that America faces. And just replacing him by Joe Biden and that sort of return to normality that we've seen is not enough to get America back on track. And, I think actually Joe Biden knows this. And it's quite interesting. There's been quite a lot of analysis you may have seen recently that, Joe Biden has spent his whole career in the middle of Democratic politics. He's not highly progressive. He's not on the conservative ends. He's right in the middle. But actually, he's been quite bold in his first 3 months. And if that continues, that could be quite transformative. So as I say, I think Biden knows there's more to solving the challenges America faces than just the pandemic and some tinkering around the edges. But it's not yet clear whether he will be able to do what is necessary to set America back on the right track, as I see it. So what are those challenges? Well, again, you'll be familiar from your studies and just watching the news with all of this, I'm sure. But the first is how seriously flawed the American democratic system is. And, I was a diplomat, so I should know these things. But genuinely, I wasn't really personally aware of quite how flawed the democratic system was until I spent time in the US and lived through a couple or more of elections. The amount of money in American politics is just it's eye-watering. It's mind-boggling. Just simple statistics. So in the 2016 presidential elections, the Americans spent $6.4 billion. That's 80 times more than the UK spent in its general election in 2015. Now, America is a much bigger country, but its population is only 5 times greater than here in the UK. The figures for 2020, which of course was a highly contested election, as we all know, as Trump fought for re-election, the Americans spent 175 times more for that presidential elections and the related congressional elections than we do for our general elections here in the UK. And what that means is those with the most money, that's the multinational companies, it's the billionaires, and it's the wealthy lobby groups, have more influence on who gets elected in the US and indeed their policies that when they get elected than the everyday voter in the US. So it's not representing, the system is not representing the American voter in the way you would think a democracy would. There's the electoral college system, which defined in the Constitution, which skews the choice of the president towards more rural, less populated states and gives them greater influence in the election. And as you know, we've seen as a result of that 2 out of the last 6 elections, the candidate who won the popular vote did not win the election. Now, it didn't happen in 2020, but it was pretty close. It was a handful of tens of thousands of votes that got Joe Biden over the line and then won the electoral college. So in my view, that's not very democratic. There's also, this is less well known, I think, but it will certainly be known by you as you study the US, the political corruption in the US, the gerrymandering that goes on in multiple states where those who are in control of the state legislature, the party, gets to define the district boundaries for both statewide and national elections. And they manipulate them so it's almost impossible for their political opposition to win. That perverts the American system. And then there's also the politicization of judicial appointments, senior judicial appointments, and we see all the debate around the Supreme Court now and what is happening there, that I think undermines the American judicial system because it makes it a political football rather than, if you like, experts, independent experts taking decisions on some of the most sensitive and difficult issues of the day for American society. I won't dwell on these too long, but there are many on the economic side too. America has an incredibly distorted and imbalanced economy. We in the UK are similar, it has to say, but not to the same extreme. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, the top 1% in the US have got vastly richer by a factor of a lot, and the majority have seen their real incomes decline. You've got social mobility in America. The sort of mainstay, if you like, of the American dream is now lower in the US than many other countries in the world, including countries in Europe like the UK, Germany, Spain, Sweden. There's a long list. You know, the American dream, if it isn't on life support, it's struggling significantly. It really is highly rare now for people, if they are born into families in the lower tier of the socioeconomic life in America, for them to move up the ladder is increasingly difficult. You've then got the myth around the successful melting pot and how when you look at the lives of African Americans and other minority groups in the US, the melting pot myth doesn't seem quite so real at all. Those communities suffer from much higher levels of unemployment, much higher levels of poverty. When they're in work, they earn significantly less than white Americans. They have worse health outcomes. They're much more likely to be incarcerated, and when they do come across justice, they're less likely to get justice in a way that a white American would expect. And we can talk about George Floyd and what has happened this week, which, from my perspective, is a positive step that shows there can be accountability for awful crimes against the Black community in the US that have been going on for years or decades. But it's not yet a transformation of the system. Systemic racism exists in the US. It exists here too, but because of that legacy of slavery, it is much more embedded in the US system, in my view, than it is here. There's then the broken healthcare system in the US, which has been highlighted by the global pandemic, leaving millions of Americans with no healthcare coverage at all, and many more, if they do have health coverage, they're underinsured. So when they go to a doctor or a hospital, they have to still fork out thousands of dollars out of their own pocket, which they can't afford. I'm sure many of you have seen or read Nomadland, which is a fantastic book if you haven't read it yet, which talks about this new society of Americans who could no longer afford, after the economic crash 10 years ago, they could no longer afford their mortgages or their rents, and they bought old camper vans and they're traveling around the US, not in a nice retired sort of holiday sort of way, but moving from farm to farm or to Amazon fulfillment center, doing really difficult low paid jobs just to make ends meet, because that's the only way they can survive, even though these people are in their 50s and 60s in the US. We can talk about the scourge of gun violence as well, with tens of thousands of killed each year. I found this, despite knowing America well and having lived there a very long, a number of years, I still find it really hard to understand the American approach to guns. It just doesn't compute. So we can talk about that. And then I think there's the hugely partisan media in the US, and we see some signs of that developing here in the UK too. But there is very little regulation of broadcast media in particular in the US. And as a result, it has become increasingly divisive and extreme. And that, in my view, has fueled the sort of political partisanship we now see and the divisions in America. And of course, you throw on top of that social media, which is highly unregulated too. And that is quite a dangerous sort of pot of potions that, if you like, can explode and cause all sorts of problems if it's not dealt with. So those are the sort of realities, I think, and some of the challenges that need to be addressed in America. We can talk in more detail, I think, in our questions about what I think needs to be done, because I am an optimist. I think Joe Biden is already focusing on the easier end of the spectrum. And when I mean easier, that's relative. He's tackling some really thorny issues around infrastructure. And he's talking about, of course, a push on equality and tackling systemic racism. None of this is easy, but that's in the sort of policy and social reform part of what I think needs to happen. That doesn't go anywhere near constitutional change or even political reform to get rid of some of the money in politics and the corruption, which I think is more challenging when America is so politically divided. So Biden has made a really good start, in my view, and I think we can be optimistic about that. But these more fundamental, these deeper systemic problems can't be ignored. And if they are, I think that the long-term future for America is at risk. I think its position as the global superpower are at risk. As the world changes very rapidly and China rises and Russia tries to expand its influence as well. And if that happens, if America can't right itself and deal with these fundamental problems, that's not just bad for America, it's bad for the rest of us in the West as well, because without that sort of strong, successful beacon of the Western system in a rapidly changing world, where in a dangerous world, the world has always been dangerous, but when it's in a period of flux, it feels that there are more challenges out there for all of us. If America isn't that strong, stable, successful beacon of the West in that period, then it emboldens the enemies of the West. The Chinas and the Russias of this world will see that there isn't anything to push back against their different approach to the rules-based international order and so on, and that will create some challenges for us all going ahead. So I'm going to stop there. That's probably more than enough. I'd be delighted to take questions from you all. I probably will ask Laura if she will sort of field the questions, because I'm on a mobile in a car, so it's quite hard to see them. But thank you, Laura. Over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Patrick, for that in-depth expert analysis. Really appreciate it. So as was just said, we've now got to the Q&A portion of our session. So I invite, and I recognize some names of some of my wonderful students here today. I invite you all to use the chat function to ask questions at any point in time. If you want to add your name and your degree, then I can attribute the questions to you. And I'm going to be asking questions throughout, but I'd love to integrate your questions in as well. So please do feel welcome to do that at any time. So to start off, Patrick, I have this sort of broad question. You're quite diplomatic in your book, reflective of your experience, of course, of being in diplomacy in terms of talking about dealing with insider Republican politics, and you even draw similarities in terms of the sort of big wigs and the idea of class in terms of how these social events look so similar between Democrats and Republicans. Probably more steak at Republicans, but there we go. So I was just wondering, how difficult was the shift for you personally from working with the Obama administration to the Trump administration? And did it in any way change your approach to the job, or how that impacted you, considering how unpredictable and unprecedented the Trump administration's approach was?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I mean, the first part of your introduction to the question, let me just touch on that briefly, and that is the class system. So, Britain is renowned for its class system, of course, and, we live here, we live and breathe it. I think in my lifetime, it's changed and it's less of an issue in some ways than it used to be, albeit it's still here. But so many Americans, when they know anything about the UK, will say, well, you're held back by your class system, and if you're not in the right whatever, you can't make it in the way that you can in America. And it's a fascinating misunderstanding of both the UK and the US. There are clearly issues here. There really are. I mean, we see them every day at the moment without getting too much into politics, but we see examples of cronyism and connections and how they work in our society. But America has built exactly the same society. They're not historic class sort of systems like we have in the UK, because it's a younger country, or indeed the sort of the political system, the ruling system was created 300 plus years ago. Of course, it's a very old country and with the indigenous American communities, but the America we know today is a young country that has been created on this notion, on this myth of egalitarianism, and everybody is treated the same and everybody can make it if they just put their mind to it. Whereas actually, and it's the examples you referred to, when you go to sort of big Democratic or Republican Party events in Washington, or indeed we hosted them in the ambassador's rather nice residence, they are high society events like you see in any other country. I mean, they are elites by definition, and that's that's just a human trait. So that's not a criticism of America in the sense of it exists in the US. I'm more critical of the fact that they think it doesn't. It does, because that's how human society has organized itself in so many ways for centuries. So it's just the way that Americans think that doesn't exist is part of their sort of mythology, if you like. But to answer your question about the Trump and Obama administration and working with them, well, the answer may surprise you in a little way, because the Trump administration was totally chaotic. I mean, he didn't expect to win the election in 2016. He's not a political animal, and so what typically happens in a US election cycle is, as the election approaches, both candidates from the two main parties are setting up significant transition teams, and these are of thousands of people, and they're people who start to, if you like, shadow each government department, start to get on top of the issues of the day that they will have to take over responsibility for should their candidate win. Trump did set up very late a transition team, but it was tiny. And then when he won the election, he fired them all and started to build something else with people that he felt more comfortable with. But of course, because he's not operated in that political space or had to run a US administration, he didn't know that many people. And so that led to all sorts of weird names being plucked by the media and all coming forward and being taken on board by the Trump administration. But it was fast moving, chaotic. There were very few people, and everybody's fighting to talk to them to work out in that transition period what Trump's policies are going to be. The number of secure video conferences I had with senior departments in Whitehall or indeed Downing Street saying, we know Trump is an unusual character and he's not a politician, but what's his policy going to be on China-India relations? Like, we've no idea. He doesn't know, and they'd say, oh yes, we understand that, we understand that, and so take your time to find out. And then a week later they'd ask the same questions. Like, this isn't how it's working now. These people are not in place. This will develop over time. And so when Trump got into the White House in January 2017, he had a very small team about him. And there are, of course, civil servants like there are in the UK. There's lots of them who run the nuts and bolts of different government departments. And so they sort of held the system together. But as you know, there's the political appointee system in the US where, thousands and thousands of positions from sort of mid-level up are all replaced when the president changes. We've seen it with Biden now and all the appointments he's making, some of which have to be cleared by Congress, others don't. But so, in the first weeks and months of the Trump administration, these people just weren't there. And so the civil servants have got no guidance. And so they're constrained on what they can do because, they're not being directed by the Trump administration. So it made working with them quite challenging in some ways. However, this is perhaps the more surprising bit. When Trump wanted to do something, or when, for example, we were trying to organize Theresa May's visit to Washington, and she ended up being the first person in the White House, the first foreign leader in the White House after his inauguration, it worked incredibly well and more easily than it did with a typical administration like Obama, because you haven't got all those layers, you haven't got all those systems in place. So we were able to say, well, normally this is what would happen. And whoever it was who at that point had been just assigned this job in the Trump administration wouldn't know any better and would say, oh, okay, yes, we can do that. So in some ways, it was completely chaotic and last minute, but in some ways it was easier than with working with a fully functioning traditional administration where you have to go through those procedures. The other thing I would say about the Trump administration was that, albeit Trump isn't a typical Republican, he was backed by the Republican Party, and the Republican Party are more traditional in many ways. They're, obviously they're the right of the political spectrum. They are more attached to those sort of traditional American values and to American history than Democrats can be. And that's a broad generalization, I know, but what it meant was Republicans love engaging the Brits because, they see us, they remember Thatcher, and Reagan, all that sort of, that special relationship, a term I hate, but that special relationship is really important to them in a way that Democrats, it's still important because we have a very close relationship with the US in so many areas, but it's not in their DNA in the same way as with Republicans. So that made, in some ways, working with the Trump administration easier. Now, to contradict myself, it was chaos. Total chaos all the time. And as we all came to learn, you never knew with Trump whether what had been agreed half an hour ago would survive, Twitter, what Trump might tweet after a meeting with the Prime Minister, or about what was going on in the UK. And indeed, he did do all sorts of tweeting on policies where we simply did not agree, and we would have to say so, but find a way that didn't undermine the relationship, which, in a typical administration, that would not happen. Those sorts of conversations would be happening behind closed doors. A way forward would be found through expert level discussions before it gets to the sort of presidential level. You just had this, a Twitter happy, trigger happy president who was saying all sorts of things that could undermine weeks or months of work. So it's a mixed bag, but it wasn't simply sort of worse than working with the Obama administration. In some ways, actually, it was easier. And just a word on Obama, who I think personally will go down as a very successful American president, not just because Trump came after him and there's that contrast, that immediate contrast, but he's not the easiest man to work with. He's at most ease when he's with a very small group of trusted advisors or on his own thinking through policy issues of the day in a sort of slightly introverted sense, if you like, which didn't make him the most sort of open and engaging sort of counterpart for British prime ministers. It was a very good relationship. It was a strong working relationship, but it wasn't necessarily a sort of a close and warm relationship. It's quite businesslike. Whereas Trump, if he liked who he was speaking to, it was still crazy. But there's a warmth and engagement with Trump and his administration, which you sometimes didn't get with Obama, actually, who's a cooler sort of fish in some ways. So it's not as clear cut as you might have imagined.
And that's really interesting insight, fascinating. I'm really interested in what you said about Republicans in history as well, because some of them, the ones who stood up after the insurrection of January 6th on the House floor, you could see that they had a clear grasp of their own history. But then, of course, the president, commander-in-chief at the time, Trump, he certainly had his own version of American history with some alternative facts thrown in there. And I was really interested in what you said as well about Theresa May being obviously the first foreign leader to visit the White House at the time, reminded me of that. And I remember watching that being in the States at the time, and how Trump very sort of excitedly demonstrated the bust of Winston Churchill he had in the Oval Office. And at the time, I kept thinking that it was a bit of a cultural faux pas, because, of course, in Britain, we don't tend to glorify our leaders in the same way. And anyone who has a sort of basic understanding of British history would think, well, that they voted him out. It's just one of those things. It's just very different, but it's really fascinating. To pick up on one of your key analysis, I was wondering how much you think this sort of anti-democratic strain in its various facets is new. You mentioned, for example, Citizens United decision that has initiated this flood of dark money and such into American politics. But you also mentioned the Electoral College, how that's been there from the beginning. The founding fathers obviously had a fear of mobocracy. And long elections, in terms of seeming to last from the previous election, can almost date back to 1824. So with all that in mind, I was just wondering how much of this is new?
Well, I mean, some of it isn't new, as you've just said, in terms of, the Electoral College is a system based in the Constitution, and you touched on why the founding fathers chose that as the way to select the president of the United States. And of course, there were different views then. I mean, it's the Constitution is looked on in the US as this sort of immovable object, but actually there was a massive debate at the time about how this should happen, and to balance the fears of mobocracy with pure democracy, if you like. But I think so that's been around a long time, but what has changed is the US itself and the rest of the world. So when the Constitution was written, the United States was, I think, 14 states basically along the eastern seaboard and a little bit inland, a little bit west. So much of the United States that we know now wasn't part of the United States of America the Constitution was written for. It was a largely agrarian agricultural economy. It was largely sort of white Europeans, Brits and others, white Europeans who were running the place and were the main sort of settlers. It was, I can't remember what the population was then, but tens of millions. It's now a multicultural superpower stretching across much of the North American continent, with a population of 360 plus million in a very different world. So it's not that the electoral college system isn't something of long standing that's been there for a very long time. I just think the environment has changed, and indeed the demands of the electorate have changed in how they approach democracy too. And I just think it's anachronistic. And so, I talk about this a little bit in the book, so what the founding fathers wanted to ensure that the sort of most populous states on the East Coast couldn't dominate the rest of their new country. So they wanted to balance that a bit. And one of the things they did to help bring that balance is that your members of the House of Representatives are the number you get is related to the population size of your state. So it's sort of direct. It's a purely, if you like, democratic system. But then in the Senate, you get 2 senators per state, no matter what size you are. So you can be Delaware or you can be California. So there's already something built into the American system that, and given the veto powers of the Senate, quite a lot in the American system, that balances the powers of the more populous, wealthier coastal states than the sort of more rural middle. But then they doubled down on that in the Electoral College for the selection of the most important position in the land, the president. So it just seems to me that I think that was a step too far, and maybe it worked at the time, but now the fact that increasingly frequently you're getting a president who hasn't been elected by hasn't won the popular majority, I think there's a problem there. And I think people are this is debated in the US too, and indeed, so without getting into the too complicated the system of the Electoral College and how it works, what happens in most states is if a candidate wins the Electoral College, they get all the Electoral College votes for that state. And so, even if you win by 50 votes in Florida, I mean, you look back to Bush Gore in 2000, whatever it was, the margins were tiny. The candidate who was ultimately decided to win got all the Electoral College votes. It wasn't given proportionately. There are a handful of states now in the US that do allocate those electors proportionately. So if you win 40% of the vote and let's say 40% of the vote and the winner gets 60%, the electors are divided 60-40. So you're bringing back the sort of direct vote into that system. So I think and there is a campaign for other states to adopt that system because it wouldn't require constitutional change. So that may be one way that the system could be changed. But of course, this is like turkeys voting for Christmas. Of course, you're probably not going to get the less populous states who get more influence in the selection of the president and the populous ones voting to do this because they're voting against themselves. So, but in terms of the money in politics, it is a more recent phenomenon. It's been around a long time, but as you mentioned, the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Committee ruling, and there's another one I've forgotten the name of just now in 2010, those basically said that either if you're an organization like a corporation or a lobby organization, you can spend anything at all on an election campaign as long as you don't speak directly to a candidate. So if you say, I'm going to support Donald Trump, and you're a billionaire, you can spend $100 million putting together TV ads saying terrible things about Donald Trump's opponent and saying why everybody should vote for Donald Trump, as long as you don't talk to his campaign. And that's what happens. And I'm sure you've seen these, and many of your students will as well. And if you haven't, go on YouTube and look at some of the electoral campaign ads that these super PACs, these committees that are funded by corporations and billionaires and others, and the NRA, the National Rifle Association and others, look at the sort of things they put out. I mean, they're shockingly inaccurate. They are fear-mongering, they're angry, and that plays into the American system in a way that can't happen in here and many other countries, where how much can be spent on an election is regulated much more closely. So I think that is newer, and something could be done about it. It will not be easy because they are Supreme Court decisions that things take years to get through the system up to the Supreme Court again, and of course those decisions were very much linked to America's purist approach to the freedom of speech. The Supreme Court basically ruled that a corporation is an individual that has the right to freedom of speech. And so because it's been entwined with that debate, it makes it quite hard to undo, I think.
Yeah, those are really excellent points. Thank you so much for that. We've had a fantastic question from Georgiana, who's a third-year history student.
Yeah.
She asks, what advice would you give to someone that wishes to go on a diplomatic career path?
Well, I mean, I had a fabulous career. I have to say, I had no idea when I started out what a diplomat really was, and I actually even struggled today to explain what it is. But of course, the core aim of a diplomat is to promote the interests of its own country, both here if you're working in the the Foreign Office in London or overseas. But that has so many elements to it. I mean, you can be doing working promoting UK British trade, you can be working to try and help secure foreign investment in the UK, you can be working on helping Brits overseas who get into trouble when they're on their holidays, whether they get arrested or whether they are in an accident. You can be involved in the visa system and how we screen people who can come to the UK or not. Highly emotive subject for obvious reasons, both in the UK and for those individuals trying to get residence visas or whatever it might be. You can work more in the political space where you're following and analysing what's happening politically or economically, indeed, in a country. So the variety in a diplomatic career is almost endless, and that's why I think it's a fascinating and interesting career. It took me, as you said earlier, to a random array of countries, from Morocco to Poland to Iran to the US, and various jobs in London. So yeah, I would encourage anybody, if they're interested, to put themselves forward to it. There's ways to get experience even when you're at university. COVID, of course, probably had an impact on this, but there's summer internship programs, and they're all on the FCO or FCDO, I should say now, website about and how they're operating just at the moment. I don't know, but they're worth looking at to get a taster for what work would be like. The caveat I would put on it, and this is not to put anybody off, for the vast majority of my career, I never felt that my personal political view was particularly challenged, and I always said, I have to say, that I think if you have strong political views of your own, as many of us do, and you were working in a domestic government department, when there is a change of government, I think that becomes more tricky, because as a civil servant, our responsibility is to implement the policies of the day, who has been elected government. And if that's in healthcare, for example, and you're seeing a government of a particular persuasion cutting money to the health service or trying to privatise half of it, and you don't agree with that, that's more challenging for your personal political views than I think generally happens in diplomacy, because broadly speaking, both parties in this country approach the foreign affairs in a very similar way. The caveat is, more recently, that has changed, I think. Brexit did, for me personally, bump up very hard against my personal political views, and it has changed the way we operate internationally, with the concept of global Britain, and I think that I found that personally more challenging for my personal politics. So if you're going into any civil service job, I think you have to be able to set aside your personal political views in a way that you wouldn't have to in other careers. And as long as you accept that and you're content with that, then I think it's a brilliant career, and I would encourage anybody to go for it.
Oh, that's fantastic advice. Thank you so much. So we have another domestic politics question, and then if we could, I'd love to do some quick fire, no pun intended, foreign policy questions.
Okay.
So one more domestic question is from Diane, and it's a great question. What do you think will happen to the filibuster?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure anything will happen to the filibuster, really. I think it might be one of those things that's it's talked about quite a lot, but it might just get parked. I think part of it will depend on what happens over the next few weeks and months. The next big thing that Biden needs to get through Congress is his infrastructure plan. if he finds that being filibustered, or he finds that the package is filleted massively to get it through the Senate in particular, because that's where obviously it's the Democrats don't have enough votes on their own, then maybe he will be tempted to do something. But if he can, Biden does come with decades of experience of working in Congress and trying to work across the aisle. If he can somehow use that to make progress on his agenda, I don't think he'll bother with the filibuster, because it's a distraction. It would be a distraction because it will be highly politicized. And you've seen with the Supreme Court as well, and the sort of the idea of should the Democrats and stack the court, should you expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court so they can rebalance it again? And he's thrown that to a sort of an independent review. And I think that's a way of Biden saying, this is a rabbit hole. We will be drawn down and never come out if we go down that route, when there's so much more to do. So I think he will try and avoid the filibuster, as he will try and avoid stacking the court and those arguments, just so he can get on. I mean, I think in the back of his mind, he won't know whether I guess he probably hasn't decided whether he's going to go run for another term, given his age. And so I think he'll be working now very much on, I might only have 4 years, so I need to get on with it. And I can't be dragged into things that are just going to be explosive politically, and detract me from delivering on some of the other things. So it's only if the filibuster stops him in his agenda will he be tempted, I think, to do something about it.
Excellent point. So Georgiana says, thank you very much, by the way, for the career advice.
No, thank you for your question.
So, yeah, it's fantastic. We have another great one from Kerry Robertson, History Year 2. And they asked, what was it like working for the Foreign Office during the Arab Spring, and your opinions on the current situation since in the Middle East? And if I could piggyback on that a little bit, I was wondering more broadly whether you think the US is a good mediator in the Middle East, especially considering the influence of pro-Israel lobbies and the connections to Netanyahu, particularly in the Trump administration, the Kushner influence, and obviously him not talking to the Palestinians at all.
Yeah. What was it like in the Arab Spring? I mean, it was both a wonderful experience of, particularly at the beginning, let's say. So in sort of December 2010, wasn't it? Moving into 2011, at the beginnings of the Arab Spring, there was a huge amount of optimism, actually, that people power, fueled by access to the internet and freedom of speech, if you like, in a way that had been so controlled in many parts of the Middle East for decades. The fact that was playing into the situation on the ground, we were optimistic. It was flat out. It was, crazy hours from dawn till dusk and weekends. And the Foreign Office has this, it's called the Crisis Center, which is in the basement. So when things are developing very fast in parts of the world, you go into crisis mode and you move anybody who's working on those issues into the same location. So typically you'd have the sort of team following the politics in one department, and you might have the team doing visa policy or looking after Brits abroad. They're in different departments, so you put them all in the same place so you can work at speed together. And I spent many weeks and months in the crisis center without daylight, sort of helping to run the operation from there. So it's exciting, it's interesting, and to start with, as I said, it was very optimistic, until we started getting into the Libya phase. So Tunisia, Egypt looked like they could go in the right direction, and then quite quickly with Libya it descended into quite chaos and violence in a way that the others hadn't. And then Syria started bubbling too, and Syria has just been an extended nightmare, basically, in a way that's just really, really sad. And so after that optimism of at the start, and hoping that there could be positive change in that region. I think it quickly became much more of a grind when you saw that the sort of interest groups were trying to make sure that their power was not taken away, and they were willing to use whatever means to stop that, Syria being the obvious case. So fascinating in terms of professionally. I personally, I did 2+ years on it, and I have to say the second year was tough, because when you're watching people being killed day in, day out, the focus at this time for me was really Syria, because that was the hottest area in sort of 2011-12. When you're seeing people being killed in appalling ways every week, and your political leaders saying, so what are we going to do about this? We need some new ideas, and every week you're giving them new ideas, but then they're being rejected, because unless the West was willing to intervene directly in these countries, there's very little the West can do to stop it. It's as simple as that. And of course, there was no appetite, understandably, for Western countries to intervene. One, because the Arab Spring was in multiple countries, and two, because of the history in Iraq and Afghanistan that was very fresh in people's minds. I personally, if you asked me personally, I would say we, the UK and the West, failed the Syrian people. And I personally think we should have intervened. And I know that's messy, and I know it's complicated, and I know that's politically fraught. But when you look at what has happened over the last 5+ years, I mean, it's horrific, absolutely horrific. And we may have had an opportunity to influence that. But the moment when the West blinked, and it blinked partly because Parliament in the UK voted against taking action against Syria when Assad used chemical weapons, and that made Obama blink, because he then took a step back and reflected on what this would mean to intervene without America's closest ally, and very quickly understood that there was no market, there was no support for intervention across America because of Iraq and Afghanistan. So he backed away too. And I think by the West backing away at that point, that allowed Russia in, and they intervened heavily, backed the Assad regime, and then made it impossible for anybody to do anything, because you're not going to take on Russia. The West is not going to take on a nuclear armed Russia over Syria. And so Syria is now in the situation it is because the West didn't intervene. So a mixed bag, fascinating, interesting, challenging, very hopeful at the beginning, but then reality set in, and it became quite tough, to be honest.
Yeah, they're very insightful. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to end with a student question, but before I do, in terms of, you said how what some people may see as a controversial stance of pro-intervention, considering the fatigue that a lot of Western countries have with intervention in the Middle East. Just on Afghanistan, obviously, as you mentioned before, very topical right now. A lot of commentators are worried, and people on the right in particular in the States, are worried that this will leave a vacuum that will enable the terrorist threat to increase again, and the Taliban to sort of grow in strength. How concerned about that should we be?
I think we should be pretty concerned, to be honest. I totally understand the American position on this. I mean, we, the West, America and its allies, have been in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years now. And there's been a huge amount of progress in Afghanistan in terms of the access of women to education and work and so on, in a way that just was not permitted under the sort of brutal Taliban regime. But, that we haven't rebuilt the country to be a Western democracy. It still stumbles along. It's a country where local warlords have a huge amount of power, where the Taliban in rural areas has been able to rebuild its power base despite having Western troops there. So, I think, as President Biden said, just staying longer doesn't fix it. I mean, the West has been there a long time, and we are where we are. So you can understand why it gets to the point where, we're putting our soldiers at risk day in, day out in a foreign country. And indeed, there has been no externally inspired terrorist attack externally organized terrorist attack in the US or in the UK since 9/11. There have been ones inspired by ISIS, but they tend to be domestic individuals who've been radicalized on the internet. They're not being organized from overseas. So that threat is different, and I guess the calculation in the US is, we can monitor with the links into Afghanistan are now so broad and so deep that they will be able to monitor the situation from the outside. I mean, there'll still be lots of aid work and other work going on there, just not military. And so there'd be, if you like, an early warning system to see whether, the Taliban was allowing extremist groups to base themselves there, and action would be able to be taken quite quickly if that were to happen. But it is risky. I mean, it does bring with it an element of risk for all of us, and particularly for the people of Afghanistan and the women of Afghanistan. If the Taliban take control again, if they revert back to their very harsh system of government, then quite a lot of progress could be overturned quite quickly. So, it's a really difficult one. There's no easy solution, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's very true. Hopefully, maybe we can find some optimism in this final question. This is from Christian Perry, a third-year history student, asking, with the spawn of democratic movements in places like Myanmar, Thailand, and Hong Kong that demonstrate as part of the named Milk Tea Alliance, do you think it will amount to any permanent change?
Specifically in Hong Kong and Myanmar and other places? You wanted optimism, didn't you?
Well, honesty comes first. I'm not going to force you. We're in a democracy. It's okay.
I'm not particularly optimistic about Hong Kong, I have to say. I think, China has tolerated the sort of one country, two systems approach in Hong Kong since 1997. But got increasingly impatient when they saw, pro-democracy demonstrators getting more vocal, as we've seen over the last few years, and demanding more freedoms. And that's not the way the Chinese system works. So I'm not optimistic that there will be positive change in Hong Kong very soon. I think that China has made it extremely clear that they will not tolerate more than a certain amount of freedoms in Hong Kong. And unless they see foreign investors fleeing and businesses closing their Hong Kong headquarters en masse, I don't think that they will be worried about the sort of the implications of their policies. I think it's, if you're looking at this from the stance of Beijing, if you start to allow real democratic freedoms in part of your territory, then they're going to be demands. Those demands could spread, and they're not ready for that to happen. So I think they will do pretty much anything they can to control Hong Kong in the way they want it to do. Myanmar, I'm not so sure. I mean, what's going on in Myanmar is shocking. But there is an incredible amount of life in their democratic movement. So I think that's really unpredictable. I don't think it looks like the military have any desire to cede control, but I think that's much more unpredictable. But what I think, to be more optimistic, I think what this does show is, we've been through a period recently of populism on the rise, both in the UK, in France with Le Pen, with in America with Trump. And maybe, just maybe, we're seeing sort of those more traditional democratic currents bubbling to the surface a bit more again. You know, Trump didn't win re-election. It was too close for comfort from my personal perspective, in part because of the electoral college system, but because of the way the US system works and how divided it's become. But he didn't win, and indeed Le Pen didn't win election in France a few years ago. And so, you know, there's a hope that you know, in the US context, bringing it back to America, that, you know, I heard somebody very, very shrewd saying the other day, you know, we shouldn't overplay the horrible divisions and bipartisanship, the partisanship in the US, and worry too much about it. The key thing is, if Biden shows he is able to deliver things that have an impact on the lives of normal Americans, so, you know, his COVID relief package that put money into people's pockets and extended child tax credits and those sorts of things, if normal Americans see that making a positive change in their lives, then they are much more likely to be drawn back into mainstream politics than you know, and so that will sort of outweigh, if you like, the noise of the sort of Fox Newses and others and the partisan media. So it's about what you deliver, and so I think that's I think that brings some optimism with it, and so I am optimistic about the future of the US. I hope they're ready to do what they need to do to sort of get back on track.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Patrick Davies, for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. Again, fantastic book, The Great American Delusion. Thank you so much for our audience for coming along and participating. And of course, last but not least, thank you so much to the History and American Studies and the Politics and International Relations Department for their support of me in this event. It's been really fantastic. Thank you, everyone, ever so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I hope it was interesting and useful, and you know, I'm happy to come back again at some point if you want to have me.